Hello, Chicago plants following. Good morning, and thanks for tuning in to our spring plant care Instagram Live. We'll let the people slowly trickle in for a minute or two, but thank you all for coming out here. And if you are viewing this via the recording in the future, we hope that we can impart some nice information regarding spring plant care on you all. So again, thank you guys for coming out. We'll get started with the information in just a little bit once a few more people join in. If you're repotting yourself at home, feel free to get your materials ready to follow along. It'll be like a Bob Ross painting session. Far less relaxing, but all the same nonetheless. So stay tuned, we'll be back in just a minute or two and we'll get going with our spring plant care. All right, guys, thank you all for slowly coming in. I'll just say at the top too, if anybody is looking to have questions answered, feel free to submit them as we go. The rough agenda for today is going to be going through some repotting and spring plant care considerations. But as we do that, if you guys want to slowly submit your questions, we'll go through them kind of as things go today. So feel free to throw those up in the comments and we'll try to get to as many of you as possible. So as people are joining, we'll get started with a few things on the top regarding spring plant care. So as I mentioned, kind of the big thing we'll go through today is repotting, which I do know can be intimidating for some folks because you feel like you're going to kill your plant through doing it, but I can promise you it's not too tricky. It's really just a matter of knowing when is appropriate, both in terms of the plant and the time of year. But then also kind of thinking about whether or not that plant is going to be sized up appropriately and those kind of considerations. So why don't we start by thinking about when it's appropriate just by looking at the plant. And so back here we have this Sansevieria black coral, which I'm not repotting, but for demonstrative purposes, just kind of want to show what to look for in terms of plants that need a repot, and then also kind of repotting offers an opportunity to propagate, especially with more mature plants. And so if we look here at this Sansevieria, these lighter green stalks right here are a perfect example of a good opportunity to propagate when you're repotting. Now this guy does have some roots that are starting to stick out of the top of the pot, and that's also a really good way to know, okay, it's probably time to repot. The roots are going outside of the soil. It needs a bigger home to continue growing effectively. But it's really through seeing these that you have a really good litmus test to say, okay, not only is the plant full in kind of the main stalks you see here, but when you repot, these guys are awesome to go ahead and put into their own pot, because these pups, through a snake plant, you're able to do root division and basically take those off and they'll grow into their own plant off of the mother plant. So keep that in mind when you are repotting, because there are a lot of good opportunities to not just repot the whole plant into something new, but think about perhaps taking something like this off. And it is really plant by plant dependent. Something like a philodendron variety, for example, does not typically propagate by root division like that, but a snake plant is a prime example, and that's actually what we'll be working with here for our repot. Now these guys here are the Sansevieria robustas, and these are a beautiful plant, but one that definitely you want to keep an eye on when repotting is necessary. And this guy here is pretty tight in this pot. And again, you kind of have that opportunity. There's 3 independent stalks that you can see here. So what I'm going to do with this guy to give him a better home to live in is not only repot, but perhaps divide it up so there aren't so many clustered into a single pot. So let's start here with what we'll be using. We've got the 2 different pots that we're going to be putting this guy into. But first, let's discuss soil considerations. So this is a snake plant, and we're going to be repotting some other varieties today, which will require different soil and considerations. But this guy here can pretty much use any well-draining potting soil that you're going to use. Those of you who follow us know that we're a big fan of the Fox Farm Ocean Forest, and that's what I'm going to be using for these guys. The main benefit that I see in using the Ocean Forest is, one, it's incredibly well-draining, which is going to be a high priority for something like a snake plant that doesn't want to sit in soggy soil for too long. But the Ocean Forest variety specifically comes rich in a lot of aquatic nutrients, so rather than having to fertilize your plant right when you go ahead and repot it, it's already going to be pretty nutrient laden just from the natural aquatic nutrients that come in the soil, as well as some earthworm casings and some bat guano, which is a fancy way of saying bat poop, but it's really good for the plants. So let's get started here. We're going to make a bit of a mess, which is probably the first consideration when you're repotting at home. If you have a counter space that you can just lay out in, that's going to be best. But also if you just want to lay down some newspapers on the floor, you know, it's a messy process. So just don't be afraid to kind of get dirty a little bit. So we're going to be starting here with this guy. The best way when something is pretty root bound to get it out is just slowly start by massaging the outside of the pot. And this is going to slowly kind of tease the roots to be less ingrained in the soil, but then also loosen things up for the plant to slide out. So here we're going to go ahead, now that this has been kind of massaged a little bit, and just slowly work it out of the pot. And like I said, this is fairly root bound, so you can see it just slid out with the roots and soil and all. And that's, you know, definitely an indicator that you're doing the right thing by repotting this guy. So when you're going through this process, you do want to discard all of the old soil. Typically, if a plant has been in soil for a while, it's going to be nutrient deprived. And a lot of times it just loses the same integrity as getting it into new potting soil. So don't be frugal and try and save some of that soil for the repot. Get new stuff. It's really going to be best for the plants. So this right here is a good example of what I mentioned before via root division, taking these Sansevierias and perhaps finding homes for them separate rather than together. And this one kind of came out naturally like this, which makes me think this might have been the mother plant and these were pups that came off of it. And so that's a really good way to kind of divide them up. We'll have this guy in its own pot and these pups in their own pot, and that'll just give them a lot more room to grow rather than shoving them all back into the same container. Even if it is a larger container, kind of nice too if you wanted to give that as a gift to somebody else. So we'll start with this one here. And again, if you're just joining us, feel free to submit questions as I'm going through the repotting. We'll be able to address as many as we can. But here we're getting the snake plant down to a point where we have a lot of that old soil off. It's always good to tease the roots as well. This is something I can't stress enough. If you have a plant that you notice is very clustered and clumped up and the roots are just rock hard together, it's really good to tease those out. And it kind of helps when you repot for them to, you know, fill into that new pot. Otherwise, a lot of times if you just plant the cluster into the new pot, it'll still grow like that cluster and it's not going to develop as robust and healthy of a root system as if you kind of tease them out like this. So this guy's looking really good for its new home. As you can see, the roots are very apparent sticking out of the bottom there, and he's looking happy and healthy. So you might have seen before, I did put a base of soil down in our pots that we're going into, and that's going to be good to start off with, just so you can kind of gauge the height that you want it to sit at. And so ideally, depending on the plant, you're going to want to think about it being far enough down that there's enough soil covering it so the roots can continue expanding into it, but also that it's buried deep enough that you're not going to have any of the roots or the bottom of the plant sticking out of the soil when you start to fill it in. So this right here is at a pretty good place to kind of leave it, and then we're going to continue filling it in with additional soil. So while I get to filling this guy in, it's a good time to talk about kind of other considerations regarding spring plant care. And number one is going to be the fertilization routine. And so you might hear from us if you come in a store, you read on our care guides. We do not recommend fertilizing throughout the winter months, and the biggest reason for that is the plants are just in their dormant period. They're not actively growing, and so providing them with an excess of nutrients, oftentimes they're not going to know what to do with those nutrients, and with certain like leafier varieties, you can even see nutrient burn on the leaves from the excess nitrogen that's in the leaves. So you generally want to think about the spring as the time of year that you start fertilizing. And then generally once the weather is getting cold again, so by like October, that's where it's probably time that you can stop fertilizing for those winter months and then wait until the spring of the following year. So this guy right here is already sitting nicely in his new home. And as I mentioned, you can kind of just see where the top of the plant is sticking out. None of the roots are visible from the top of this. And clearly if I were to poke into the soil, I'm not like immediately hitting into roots. This is an appropriate size up. And so I was going with this one from a 6-inch pot into 2 new 6-inch pots. That being said, if you had a 6-inch that you're keeping the whole plant together and you're looking to size it up, the considerations that you want to have are, one, what size pot is it in? If you were in a 6-inch pot, typically you'll go up 2 inches into an 8-inch pot. Now, that changes a bit once you get to more mature plants. If you have something in a 14-inch container, you don't necessarily go right up to a 16-inch. It kind of becomes a little more gradual as the plants grow larger. And so I always tell people at the beginning, from like the 4 to 6-inch range, you're going to be repotting every year. But as things get more mature, you're not going to be repotting as frequently, for one, and two, not sizing up as large each time as when the plants are younger. Tony, if you have an organic liquid-based fertilizer, is it okay to water each time with it during warmer season? To that, I would say not each time, because typically your plants are going to be watered more than monthly. And depending on the fertilizer, the one that we use in store is the Earth Medicine. And this is one that you just want to give monthly. That's typically going to be the case even with your liquid fertilizers. So let's say you have a philodendron that you're watering every week. 3 out of those 4 waterings are going to be just water, and that 4th one each month can be the one that you include the fertilizer in. And again, that cadence will depend ultimately on the plants. There are flowering varieties like the African violet, for example, which typically if you want healthy blooms, you're probably fertilizing every other week for that guy. But again, just make sure that you check for the specific variety of plant because it will be slightly different. General rule of thumb though, for most of your philodendrons, pothos, sansevieras, that's going to be a monthly cadence. We have here, are snake plants able to survive in just water? So yes and no. It's the best way to propagate a snake plant aside from root division is by taking a cutting, something like this, cutting it off, and we actually have one back here. And this right here is what things will look like if you are propagating your snake plant. This is literally just a mason jar filled with water and nothing else, and you have your snake plant stalk that was cut at its base, or really anywhere. Snake plants are quite effective at propagating. Now, kind of the other side of your question is, can they live in water? I wouldn't say you want to keep it this way once the roots have fully developed. So you'll get to the point, and it's not going to happen overnight, but typically between 6 and 8 weeks, the roots will slowly start to develop, and you'll see them at the very base of the plant that's sitting in the water. That's when you know this guy no longer needs the water to propagate, but is ready to be potted into a soil medium. They are not one that typically takes well to staying in water. Now there are plenty of pothos varieties that actually can be hydroponic very easily. The only consideration as far as that goes is that if you do decide to have a plant be hydroponic like a pothos, you really won't have the opportunity to switch it over to soil because they've kind of gotten used to that home in water. And if you were to go and repot it into soil, it'll kind of disrupt that plant and oftentimes they'll just die off. So as far as this snake plant goes that we just repotted, now, as I mentioned, he's in a good place height-wise. The next thing you want to do after a repot like this is go ahead and water the plant. And this is kind of going to be effective twofold. One, it's going to help compact everything that you just put in there, so it's not going to be wiggling about as much as if you just left it in the soil. But also this plant, one, needed to be watered. It's best to do your repots with drier soil. It's going to make things a little easier. But then you're also just going to give that plant the water right at the beginning, so it's not going to be thirsty going into a new pot, which is already kind of a stressful experience. So we'll go here and give this guy a good watering, and we'll take this opportunity for those of you who are unfamiliar with our plant care guides in terms of watering. The biggest thing you want to remember is that fewer big drinks are better than frequent little drinks. And so anytime you're going to be watering a plant, whether it's a snake plant, your philodendrons, anything you have at home, you want to give it enough that it's going to be trickling out of the drainage holes. And so I gave that guy a good bit of water. You're going to see here, we have it trickling out, and I just have it going into a drainage tray here. And once that's done trickling, we'll take it, set it aside, let it dry. Ultimately, you do not want to let your plant sit in water after it's drained. So if you have a planter that might have a drainage dish below it, that's fine, but just make sure as the water does trickle out that you go ahead and discard that excess water from the drainage dish. And we have a question here as to how to propagate a monstera. That's a great question because it's a very easy one to propagate, thankfully, and one that if you have a beautiful monstera at home, you can give it to friends by propagation. It's going to be a little different than the snake plant in that they don't have the same ability for root division. However, you are going to have the ability to chop off, and Megan, do you mind grabbing the monstera and I can kind of show how that works? You will be able to show how through just cutting off one of the stems, you can take that stem, as long as it's healthy and has at least one leaf on it, put it in water the same way I showed with that Sansevieria, and it'll eventually develop those roots, as I mentioned, typically between 6 and 8 weeks. And so here we have a beautiful monstera in a 12-inch pot, and this guy right here has a lot of good foliage. Obviously, you don't want to try propagating a plant if it just has 1 or 2 leaves and it's barely getting by. You can't take its few leaves off of it or it might die. But this one right here has plenty to go around. So if you were to take this right here, which is one stalk off of a main larger leaf cluster, and trim that off, put it in water the same way I demonstrated with the Sansevieria, and that stalk itself, as long as I mentioned it has one leaf, will start to develop those roots in the water. And once again, it gets to the point that it's developed the roots, you can think about taking it out and potting it into soil before the plant gets too used to its new hydroponic home. And then we have here regarding the monstera again, got it in March in an 8-inch and it's growing fast. Should I fertilize it first? That's a great question. So typically speaking, if you're going to have a repot coming up, don't start with the fertilization quite yet because it's only going to encourage kind of rapid growth and the plant to get into a position to continue filling that pot. So if you wanted to do your repot first, again, it's a little easier if you have a drier plant, so that's another consideration. Let it dry out, go ahead, do your repot, and then go ahead, water it, and you can fertilize it in the coming weeks. But if you have that on your horizon, it's not as much of a pressing thing for you to fertilize it before it gets that new repot. So we're gonna go ahead here with the second Sansevieria. And for those that are just coming in, it'll give you an opportunity to see this from the start. As I mentioned, I'm just kind of going to give a base of soil for our Sansevieria to sit in. And ultimately, that's going to just make sure that its roots are far enough down that they can develop downwards, but they're not sitting too high that it's not getting fully covered. And so this right here is pretty good. Now, if I wanted to, for what it's worth, this right here could probably be separated into 2 separate pots. I'm going to put them into this one right here, as snake plants are one variety that does not mind being a bit more root bound. Ultimately though, that's going to be dependent on your plant variety. There are plenty of ficus on the other hand that really do not like being as root bound, and they're going to be fighting for nutrients. With these very easy snake plants, however, it's less of a consideration. Okay, we have here how to propagate a ZZ plant. ZZ plants are a lot like the snake plant in that they, for one, do not take to cutting the way you would with the monstera as I demonstrated, but the root division through their rhizomes are what you're going to focus on for thinking about which ones are viable to propagate. And so here, I'll show you how things look with what a rhizome exactly is, first off with a ZZ plant. So if you look here, these tuberous stalks at the base of the ZZ will go under the soil and they almost have a bulb. It's not an actual bulb-like plant as a canna lily, for example, but those bulbous rhizomes are what you will be able to divide off of the main plant and ultimately propagate those separately. You are able to do cutting type propagations with the ZZ. It really does not take as well and will take an enormous amount of time. So typically speaking, when you have one that's this large, the best way is finding, like this guy right here has probably the most distinct stalk outside of the main one. And taking that entire bulb out from the main one, you'll be able to repot that and propagate it when you're doing a spring repot. So we'll get back here to our sansevieria that we're just filling in. As I mentioned here, this guy is sitting just an inch or two up from the bottom of the pot and able to fully cover the top so we don't have any roots sticking out. That'll really just give this guy a nice new home while creating some extra space. So this guy right here, as I mentioned, we were gonna wait for him to finish draining, no longer has any water coming out. So we'll set him off to the side here and we'll put this guy in for watering. Like I mentioned before, important to do when you repot, just make sure that it can fully find its new roots and its new soil mixture without any wobbling and also not leaving it a time to get thirsty. So we'll go ahead and water this guy. While I'm doing this, we'll talk about another component of spring plant care, and that's going to be considering the difference in how bright the sun is during the spring. Now, in the winter months, we talk about how plants go into dormancy, the sun is not shining as brightly, and the plants know that, and it's why they're just not growing as actively. However, because the sun is going to be warmer in the spring, you can think about it really with two considerations in mind. One is going to be where you have your plants, and a lot of folks know that they have cold, drafty windows, and during the winter months you want to move your plants away from those. The spring is a good time that if you have those varieties, like for instance a Ficus robusta, and you want to put it back in that windowsill, it's going to appreciate the extra light. You don't have to worry about the cold drafts bothering it. But similarly, if you have plants in windowsills that during the winter months, you just know they're not getting as much sunlight. If it's going to be a variety that's going to have burning on the leaves, like a Dracaena, for example, perhaps during the spring and summer months, you want to move those a little further away from the windows, especially if you have like a bright western-facing exposure. That'll be helpful just to make sure your leaves aren't burning on these plants. We have here from Nancy, how would you know it's time to repot the ZZ plant? That one's going to be a lot like the snake plant in a lot of ways, but primarily in that they don't mind being a little more pot bound. There are plants, as I mentioned, that need new homes regularly. That one, you can wait for it to really be to the point where those roots are climbing out from the bottom of the pot's drainage holes to the top. That's when you're going to know for sure it needs that new home if it's going to continue growing healthily. But I'll say don't do it if it's not necessary with those ZZ plants. They like to really grow a more robust root structure in their pots. So if you're inappropriately doing a repot ahead of when it really needs it, you're actually going to notice slower growth in the plant because it's just not effective at gaining nutrients when it has a lot of soil that it's drowning in. So here we have our freshly watered snake plant, and again, we're just letting him drain out as we don't want him sitting in any excess liquid. Okay, so we're all done with that guy. Feel free to continue submitting questions as we go along here, but I'm gonna move on to another repot, which is just a little succulent. in this wonderful elephant potter. And where this is going to be a little bit different is mainly just the soil consideration. We use just a standard Fox Farm soil for that Sansevieria, and that's going to be most effective in making sure it's in a well-draining potting soil that's rich in nutrients. However, when it comes to a succulent, you're going to want something even better draining than just your standard, more peat-based potting soil. And so here in the store, typically we're going to use as a base 1 scoop of that Fox Farm to kind of just put in some of the nice peat and organic material, but you're going to complement this with the 1 part soil, 1 part perlite, which is a volcanic rock. It works really well in both giving some structural integrity to the potting mixture, but also gives it the aeration that these succulents really need. So there we have our 1 part perlite, and last but not least, we will go ahead with 1 part sand. Now, a trick of the trade for those of you at home who are looking to do this same mixture for your succulents and cactus, you can find on Amazon bags of sand that's meant for houseplants, and you'll get a very small bag for like $12, $15, and you'll go through it really fast. Conversely, if you go to your local hardware store and you get a bag of play sand that you would put in a kid's play container or you were using for landscaping purposes, you'll be able to get 50-pound bags for the same price as the ones if you were just getting those smaller ones on Amazon meant for houseplants. Sand is sand. So at the end of the day, don't be paying more for your sand. There's a lot of it. Just go to a beach sometime. So we have our mixture here. You can see the 3 parts of the sand, the perlite, as well as the organic potting soil. And we're just going to give this a nice mix up. And the idea, again, with this mix for the succulents is really giving an incredibly fast draining mixture that does not retain moisture as actively and effectively as something just like a peat-based potting soil does. We have here from Monstera Mom, how do you know if the pot's too big? So that was kind of the consideration we mentioned earlier with regards to what you're sizing up from. Now, if you're going from a 4 or 6 inch pot, typically 2 inches is the rule of thumb. So if you're in a 4 inch pot, size up to a 6 inch. If you're in a 6 inch, size up to an 8 inch, and an 8 to a 10. As I mentioned though, that kind of cadence is going to slow as the plant matures and you're no longer every year doing that 2 inch repot. But typically speaking, that's your rule of thumb, just 2 inches larger than the current pot. Gives it a little room to grow into without too much room that it's just going to be drowning. As a rookie plant owner myself, I once repotted a Philodendron hoaxellum from an 8 inch into a 14 inch. And this was many, many years ago when I didn't really know all of the things I do today about plants. And I slowly realized it was not growing as effectively as when I had it in the smaller pot, because it's kind of just struggling to find the same root structure that it had in a tighter container that's more appropriate for the plant. It eventually matured into that 14 inch pot, but it did so much more slowly than if I had just gone from the 8 to a 10 and not the drastic jump up. All right, we have from Tony here, do you typically water cacti and succulents as you would other indoor houseplants? And that is a great question. The answer is no. A lot of people are interested in succulents and cactus as like a first time plant because they know they're easy and they're low maintenance. That is kind of the key, is realizing and respecting that they are low maintenance. And the only way most folks are going to kill a cactus or a succulent is by overwatering it. They are incredibly susceptible to root rot. They are from the desert and want to be treated accordingly. And as you can imagine, it's not raining in the desert on a weekly basis or even close to that. So I typically recommend to folks, even throughout the summer months, every 2 to 4 weeks is going to be the best cadence for your cacti and succulents. And that's going to depend on how much light they're receiving, because if they're outside getting full sun or in a western facing exposure with that good afternoon light, you're going to be watering a little more frequently. But that being said, if you do have a cactus or a succulent in a northern facing exposure, you're going to really be on the more 4 week side of that 2 to 4 week cadence that I mentioned. So Here we have our mixture of the the pumice, the sand, as well as the potting mix. And we're gonna put some of that here into our little elephant man. And here, again, we have our pot that is quite full with this little succulent guy. And even though it's small, we can still do the same massaging of the outside. Just give it a nice little squeeze, and you should be able to slide it right out. And as you can see here, I know it's just a succulent. We get a lot of questions regarding succulents and their roots. As you can see here, this succulent has quite robust roots, no different than your typical leafier foliage. I know it's a small little guy, but still treat it with the same respect as you would a larger plant, because they need all of the same care minus the water. So we're going to go ahead here and start getting some of that soil off, as we mentioned, and just kind of tease those roots out. Like I said, this one actually is a really prime example of a plant that was really tightly rooted into its pot. And if you are not doing this kind of teasing of the roots, it's just going to be much slower at developing into the new pot that you're putting it in, as the roots are going to be clumped up and not as readily able to expand. So we have our elephant pot that has been roughly half filled with the soil mixture that we're going to use. And we can kind of just set that there as we go about filling in around it. Now, when you're doing these kind of smaller decorative pots like this, it's going to be a little bit trickier to make sure you're filling in around the plant. So just kind of play with it. Sometimes it helps to turn as you go, just to make sure all of the corners around it are getting filled in. You don't want any pockets within the container where there is no soil and the water can just kind of sit there. And as we're filling this in, it's always good to see that if the plant needed to be held up as you first started the repot, it should become fairly structurally sufficient on its own. That's how you know that it's sitting in a good place, not too low, but also not too high that the roots are sticking out. And a lot of times just a good little shake can adjust all of that soil to fill all of the pockets. Here again, we're going to fill in just a little bit more. And this guy is good to go. So we have our succulent and Mr. Elephant here. And this guy we'll water in just a moment, but before we do that, I'll get to a few other questions that we have coming in from folks. So we have here from Smalls, what is the best soil mix for the Monstera? That's going to be just your good, well-draining potting mix. Something like I mentioned, our Fox Farm Ocean Forest that we use here in the store is going to be the perfect mix for a Monstera. They like something that's good in the organic materials like peat, but also a lot of the soil mixtures like the Ocean Forest come with perlite mixed in, helps with that drainage, gives something like a Monstera something well-draining, that it can develop its roots into nicely. And with that Fox Farm, having the ocean mixture of aquatic nutrients also kind of helps the Monstera in feeding it right when it gets that repot and not needing to fertilize so immediately. All right, so the last plant that we'll be repotting is our Calathea or Bifolia over here. And this guy you can see is already getting quite large for his tiny little 4-inch pot. And even on the bottom, you're able to see some of the roots starting to get to the drainage holes and trying to creep outside of it. So that's when you really know it is time for the repot. And this, as I mentioned, a good example of it's in a 4-inch right now. We'll go into a 6-inch pot to give it a little more room without overwhelming it with way too much room that it's just going to drown in the soil. And as we get to that, I'll discuss a few other aspects as far as our spring plant care concerns go. Now, we mentioned fertilization, we mentioned our difference in climate and whatnot, but it's also going to be important to think about your watering schedule that's no longer the same that you might have done over the winter period. It's typically going to be expected that you're not watering as frequently during the winter months, even if it is something like a philodendron that generally likes that 7 to 10 day schedule. You'll be pushing that back likely, as there are plenty of days during the winter that the Chicago sun is just not as bright and not giving it the amount of sunlight that it really needs. And that's going to affect your watering schedule. That's why a lot of folks want like a set number of days when they come in and get a plant. And that's just not the right way to think about it, because ultimately I can tell you, every 10 days, but that's going to be different depending on your situation at home, whether that's your relative humidity, whether it's the amount of sunlight it gets. There are a lot of factors at play. And when it comes to thinking about your plant into the spring and summer months, it's the same in that you're no longer going days at a time without that bright sunlight. It's going to be receiving a lot more starting in the April, May, going through October, and that's going to require more watering as a result. So know on both sides of the spectrum, whether you're coming into spring, you might water more often, or you're going into winter and you have to hold back a little bit. Do make sure you adjust. It's always best, honestly, just to kind of learn your plant eventually. You can always do the finger test, stick it in there, and decide how wet or dry the soil is. It's also not a bad idea to just kind of learn the weight of your plant when not only it's dry, like this orbifolia, or when it's freshly watered, like this sansevieria. The weight's going to be very different. And at some point after you've had a plant for long enough, I myself can tell with most of mine just by picking up their planter and knowing whether or not it needs water. So we're going to get started on our Calathea orbifolia here. Now, once again, we have a slightly different soil consideration. We went over the just standard potting mix for our snake plant, the sand pumice mixture that we used for the succulent. And now with the Calathea, you're going to want something that's a little bit heavier in either a peat moss, or here in store we use coconut coir. Peat moss is something that, believe it or not, is slowly going extinct in the world because of the boom of the plant industry and overcultivation of the existing supply of peat that we have. So if you have the ability to get coconut coir over peat moss, you're doing the right thing for the environment. Coconut coir is sustainable, and it just provides the exact same kind of moisture retention, nice organic material for something like a Calathea without being as damaging to the environment. So as I mentioned, it's still going to be a mixture. Typically for a Calathea, I'll shoot for something like a 50-50 of both the coconut coir as well as that Fox Farm mix. So here we'll put in 1 scoop of our Fox Farm and 1 scoop of the coconut coir, and we'll mix that all around. And so as you're thinking about the function that the coconut coir serves for something like the Calathea, as you may be aware, if you have a Calathea, they don't want to dry out. The fastest way to kill a Calathea is by either having inadequate humidity or forgetting to water it, as they are a plant that needs to remain evenly moist but not soggy, just to kind of keep the leaves full and supple, and they do just dry out so fast. So do bear that in mind in terms of the purpose that the peat moss or coconut coir serves. So here we have our beautiful orbifolia sitting in its new potting mix. I'm going to go ahead and fill it in again with 1 more scoop of the coconut coir, as well as an additional scoop of our Fox Farm. And again, it's always good just to make sure that you're getting this nicely mixed in. Just try your best to kind of layer out both the coconut coir as well as that soil, making sure that it has a good even dispersion. And so here I actually potted the Calathea in a little bit lower than I would have wanted to at the beginning. So an easy way to just bring it up a little bit once you've got the soil already in the pot is just slowly kind of shaking it upwards and allowing some of that soil beneath it to fill in. And so that's sitting in a place that I'm a little bit more comfortable with. Again, kind of just evenly dispersing our coconut coir as well as the soil. And for everybody that is kind of taking these spring plant considerations in mind with their plant care, we might have seen that it's going to be snowing this next week here in Chicago, and if that's the case, don't feel like you jumped the gun on spring plant care. One day is not going to throw your plant out of whack or put it back into dormancy. It's really, we've had those 70-degree days already, and the sun's getting brighter. So as a whole, your plants are not going to mind if you start treating them like they're in their growing period. So here we have our orbifolia, nicely repotted in its new home, and as you can see, it is already quite full, so this was an overdue repot for it. And because, again, the calatheas do not want to dry out, this one more than any of them need that good watering after the repot. And we'll go ahead and let that drain out, as we mentioned. Now, as far as the actual water that we're using for the calathea, it's worth mentioning these are a plant that do not like hard tap water as much as many others don't care about it, like the Sansevierias. These will typically get kind of the browned leaf tips, and it's never much. It's just as simple as kind of the browned edge that you might see there. It's nothing fundamentally wrong with the plant. However, a lot of the chemicals that are in our tap water are a little bit hard on calatheas in particular. So if you can use distilled or filtered water, that's going to be your best bet. Alternatively to that, rainwater is a really good option if you're collecting it. Or what we do here in the store, just for the sake of ease, we fill multiple buckets each evening. So by the next day, we have a water that's slightly more, I should say less chemically laden than when we take it straight out of the tap. A lot of the most harmful chemicals, like chlorine specifically, that is in our tap water will evaporate out overnight. So if you don't have a filter or don't want to buy distilled water, that's the best way to just make sure you're getting a slightly better source than taking straight out of the sink and going to your plants with it. Okay, so our calathea here has fully drained out. And as I mentioned, if you did have this in a pot or a planter, make sure that you are draining the excess water from its drainage dish to make sure it's not sitting in any water. So there we have our Sansevierias, which from 1 we got 2. We have our calathea, which from a 4-inch we went up to the 6-inch. And lastly, we have our little elephant planter with our succulent guy. I guess last thing I'll mention is kind of how I'll go about fertilization with these. We do use earth medicine here in store, which is a great product to use. It's all organic. It's microbial versus a lot of the chemical fertilizers you'll get in stores. It's easier on the plants in that you don't have to worry about things like nitrogen burn, for example. But being that it is microbial, it's a lot more effective at sustaining kind of long-term longevity with your plant rather than just giving it a boost of chemicals to try and make it grow as fast as it can. Now, I'm not going to fertilize any of these guys today. As I mentioned with that Fox Farm Ocean Forest, it is very rich in nutrients already. And it would kind of be overkill to just hit it right away with the earth medicine. Now that being said, within the coming weeks, once these have settled into their new pots, that'll be a really good time to go ahead and fertilize them. So here, for the sake of demonstration, this earth medicine is a pellet-based fertilizer. We did have Tony ask earlier regarding liquid-based fertilizers, which are very common. Those you'll typically just do as you water. The earth medicine, though, is it is the pellets. You're able to just pour it out into a cap or a tablespoon, sprinkle it over your plants. And when you water, that'll seep into the plants and kind of get to its roots and allow the plant to best absorb all of the earth medicine that it's getting. It will depend on the size of your plant, how much fertilizer you want to give it. With the earth medicine, it's a tablespoon for something smaller or medium-sized and up to 2 tablespoons for larger plants. But make sure if you are using a chemical fertilizer that you do read the instructions, make sure you're using an appropriate amount. As if you use too much, it's going to be hard on the plant and it doesn't know what to do with those extra nutrients. So that is all the material I hope to cover today, and I'm thankful for everybody that came out as well as all the questions. If you do have any outstanding questions that you didn't get to, be sure to comment on either this post or feel free to shoot us an email as always. We're here to help all hours of the day with all of your plant care questions, so don't hesitate to reach out. We hope this was helpful for some folks, and we'll see you next time.